Thank you so much for joining us today. Just so you know, this session will be recorded and we will be sharing the recording with people afterwards who've signed up who were not able to make it today. So I wanted to welcome you all from all places of the world today for this McGill Leadership Impact Series, this month's webinar featuring Dr. Anita Nowak, who I will introduce shortly. So my name is Ron Dirksen. I'm the Global Executive Director of the International Master's Program for Managers. The IMPM, as it's called, is a global executive program with 5 academic partners around the world. And it was founded by Professor Henry Mintzberg from McGill over 25 years ago with the objective of transforming the practice of management around the world. And Professor Mintzberg's vision is based on the premise that leadership is management with lasting impact. And it's in that spirit that we launched this McGill Leadership Impact Series, which is a monthly interactive webinar that focuses on what management and leadership, in what ways management and leadership can have a lasting and positive influence in the world. So today we are very honored and pleased to welcome Dr. Anita Nowak. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you.
Dr. Anita Nowak is a professor at McGill University. She's an empathy expert, author, award-winning educator, international speaker, and certified coach. A Montreal native, Anita holds a doctorate degree from McGill University, where she is named Professor of the Year in 2014 and 2019. And I've spoken to her students. I think she's a Professor of the Year every year. So she's held a variety of leadership and advisory roles within the private and nonprofit sectors and volunteered for many social purpose organizations over the past 20 years in Canada and around the globe. Personally, I've known Anita for nearly 25 years, and I'm very fortunate to count her as a trusted colleague and a friend. Her practice of and passion for empathy has been an inspiration to me and to countless others. And she's been a trusted coach and mentor to many executives and has inspired an entire generation of students to consider empathy as an essential part of successful business practices. Today, Anita will be sharing insights from her recent book, Purposeful Empathy, Tapping into Our Hidden Superpower for Personal, Organizational, and Social Change. The book helps individuals and organizations learn strategies and practices to leverage empathy in the workplace in order to increase individual and organizational engagement, productivity, resilience, well-being, leadership, creativity, and innovation. So today, Anita will be focusing on what the research says about empathy and its direct links to company performance indicators. Today's session will be fairly interactive. Anita will be presenting for about 40 minutes. There will be moments in which she will ask you, the audience, to participate. We also invite you to put your questions in the chat, and we will try our best to get Anita to answer them. We will have time at the end for an open Q&A. First of all, welcome, Anita, again. And second, congratulations on the new book, Anita. I was really impressed with this book and how your book seamlessly blends rigorous research, inspiring anecdotes, and what I found to be really easy to follow implementation suggestions. So a very fun to read, insightful, and practical book. So Anita, I just wanted to ask you a question before you begin the presentation. What was the moment or that time in your life where you first realized the power of empathy and that you needed to become what you self-proclaimed to be an empathy evangelist?
Oh, that's a great question, Ron. And thank you so much for the invitation. To be part of this impact series actually is quite meaningful to me. And I'm so delighted that we are such a large number. I don't see all of your faces, but I see that there's another Anita on the call. So welcome. And I know that someone's here from Bangalore. So welcome all of you. You can spend your hour doing a bunch of other things. And here you are ready to talk about empathy for the next hour. To answer your question, Ron, when I was learning about the neuroscience of empathy, I started doing a lot of experiments, and I have a very distinct memory of being at a... Oh, I hear a little echo. If everybody could turn their mute button on, that would be very helpful. So I remember being in a lineup at a FedEx counter, FedEx store, in the holiday rush of maybe 10 or 12 years ago. I'm already verklempt talking about this story because it's such a meaningful one to me. So this is before we all had phones as natural appendages to our hands. So I was in a lineup for about half an hour before I got to the counter, and nothing to distract us. So everybody in the lineup was a bit bored and annoyed. And I got to the counter and the woman who greeted me was rude. And I don't mean just a little bit rude. I mean, just really off the charts, nasty rude. And I had such a reaction to her that I wanted to call her out on it. But because I'd been studying the power of empathy, I had this flash of insight to just quietly ask her, "Are you okay?" And she took a second to determine whether or not I was being sincere or maybe passive aggressive and sarcastic, but I wasn't. I was very genuine. And she burst into tears. And she said, "I've been working for 2 weeks straight, double shifts. My son's at home with a fever. I think I'm getting sick. It's 3 p.m. I haven't had a lunch break. I'm just exhausted." And I reached across the counter and we held hands and we were both crying. And 30 seconds earlier, I hated her. And then all of a sudden we were bound by sort of what I call an empathic embrace. And I think that was probably the most powerful, unique moment where I felt empathy is our superpower. So thanks for asking that, Ron.
Thanks, Anita, for answering that question, and thank you for being here. So feel free to go ahead and start your presentation. And as I said, I'll be monitoring the chat for any questions. And if I feel that the question is better answered towards the end, then we'll leave it towards the end.
Great. So
Thank you.
I have a very photo heavy slide deck, but before I turn over to the slides, I just want to share that I didn't plan to study empathy. Empathy found me through the data of my PhD. So I was doing my doctoral degree in education at McGill, and I was really interested in developing curriculum that would inspire the next generation of leaders to pursue careers in impact. And so I interviewed dozens and dozens of social entrepreneurs. Those are sort of the professional change makers of the world. I was interviewing people from around the world at startup and at full scale with, full funding. I was agnostic to the topic. So I interviewed some people working on women's empowerment and others on global literacy, climate change, poverty reduction. I just wanted to understand if they had anything in common to inform my thinking about pedagogy. And through the research that I did, which was narrative inquiry, was just basically asking questions about their life, I discovered that they had two things in common. And I mean, I interviewed dozens and dozens of social entrepreneurs, and without one single exception, they had two things in common. The first was that they all had service modeled in their home. So their parents brought them to volunteering, and just the idea of giving back was baked into their family culture. I thought that was really interesting. And the second thing was that they were all motivated to act on the empathy that they felt for others who were marginalized or suffering or, discriminated in some way. And they couldn't turn a blind eye. They felt this compulsion to act on the empathy that they felt. And that for me was a really big insight. And so I've been passionate about empathy ever since. For more than a decade, I've looked at how empathy can be leveraged for personal relationships to improve, also organizational culture, and the way that we can change the world through public policy and discourse. So that's the backstory. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides now. And Ron will be keeping a look on whether or not there are questions. So we're going to talk about the power of empathy to improve KPIs. We're really looking at this from a leadership and organizational lens. I have been collecting everything about empathy for years, and I've been posting daily empathy posts on all my social channels for over 6 years. I'm coming very close to 2,500 consecutive days. And the last couple of years, it's all been about empathy in leadership, empathy in the workplace. No accident, obviously, given what we've gone through for the last couple of years. And I just wanted to share just a couple of stats at the top end of the talk to say that, look, 2/3 of people, of employees, understand that it's important for business success, but only 1 out of 5 say it's rewarded. And I think that delta is worth looking at. Another stat is that the lion's share of CEOs, so even at the C-suite, know that it's important for business outcomes, but 7 out of 10 feel that they'd be less respected if they showed it at work. And that is, again, another kind of jarring stat. We want to debunk that myth because people want to work for empathic leaders. So the key questions I'm going to ask or answer over the next 40 minutes or so is, what is empathy? Why is it so important? What does it have to do with business success? How can we become more empathic leaders? And how can we co-create more empathic organizations? And I hope that not only are we going to think about this from the point of view of workplaces, but I also hope that some of what I might share today will be useful in your personal life, with your families, with your community, and of course at work. So when I'm asked the question, and maybe what we'll do is sort of just to get into the audience participation right out of the gates, let me ask you to put in the chat box what you think empathy is. If you had to describe what empathy is to you, what would you say? And let's not be all McGill about this. Let's not be too sophisticated. Imagine you're a 10-year-old kid and you have to explain what empathy is. I'll give you 30 seconds to just put something in the chat box while I reach for some water.
We have feeling others people, feeling other people's feelings,
Mm-hmm.
the ability to feel what someone else is feeling, show the human side,
Beautiful. So when I
understanding colleagues' issues.
when I ask this question, and I guess this picture is a giveaway, I usually get 3 answers. So 3 categories of answers. So stepping into someone else's shoes, seeing through someone else's eyes, and feeling what someone else is feeling. And those are all perfectly reasonable answers to what does empathy mean. What I want to do is a little primer, a basic 101 on what empathy is from the 10 years or so that I've spent studying it, and how it relates to the questions that we're going to get to. So the first thing is that empathy is actually often confused with a few other words like pity and sympathy, and conspicuous by absence is compassion, but I will talk about that in a minute. And what I'd like to say is I put this on a continuum. On one side is the pity side, the other is the empathy side. On the pity side of this altruistic emotion continuum is a sense of power. So when you pity someone, there's power asymmetry embedded in the relationship. You look down on people that you pity. Oh, you poor person. And a lot of foreign aid or philanthropy is predicated on a paternalistic pity paradigm. That's not what empathy is about. And I'd say it's really important to know that there's research showing that as we climb any hierarchy and we become more powerful within any system, there's an inverse and negative correlation to empathy. So the more power we have, the less empathy we have. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind so that we can mitigate against that. As we make our way across this continuum to empathy, there is a recognition that we share a common humanity. I call empathy the innate trait that unites us in our common humanity, but with an important caveat, and that is that we don't deny or discount lived experience. So we all share emotions like joy and fear and shame and hope and love. That's what unites us, and empathy is what connects us, but we can't ever really, really know what someone else is going through. So we don't want to project onto someone. But empathy is the equalizer. All right, so we want to avoid pitying and sympathizing. We want to empathize with someone, and I'll share how to do that. The second thing to know about empathy is that it's actually 2 phenomena in one. The first is affective empathy, and that's what happens to us, and it has to do with connecting with our heart and our emotions. So I want you to pay attention to what happens to your face naturally when you see this picture. I bet if I saw you, you'd feel that your cheekbones are going up and your eyes are just sort of glittering. And now watch what happens to your facial expression as you see this picture. So what just happened is that we're reacting to stimulus and we're actually feeling our mirror neurons fire. So our mirror neurons are constantly looking for ways to be in emotional resonance with sort of the stimulus around us, and that happens to us naturally. It can also happen through sound. If you, for example, are watching a horror movie and the volume's up, it tends to be really scary. But if you turn the volume down to silence, the film isn't as scary anymore. So that's affective empathy at play. When we watch somebody stub their toe, we wince. When we walk by a park and we hear children laugh, it puts us in a better mood. That's affective empathy at play. And that's very much like compassion. It has to do with feeling what someone else is feeling. And our bodies do that quite naturally. The other part of empathy that I think is the more powerful part of empathy, because we control it through our neocortex, is cognitive empathy. It's the perspective taking. So we can do a little audience participation here as well. Ron, I'm going to invite you to choose one of these puppies to work with, either the little guy on the left, the middle, or the right.
Little guy on the right.
Beautiful. Okay. So everybody look at the little puppy on the right. Look at the puppy's facial expressions and body language, and try to imagine what your puppy is thinking. And then I would invite everybody again to use the chat box to put in a little sentence what your puppy would say if your puppy could speak. And let's not make it complicated. Let's make it 5 or 8 words. So I'll give you a moment to think about that. And then just jot in the chat box, what would your puppy say if your puppy could speak? And then Ron, if you wouldn't mind reading out some of the answers that come in,
Sure.
that would be super helpful.
So we have learn from me. What's this? I'm apprehensive. I really need a hug.
Mm.
Hug me. My own reaction was he's kind of looking over to the side. So I'm like, what are you doing over there? Come over here. Like there's a sense of longing in his eyes.
Beautiful.
Uh, Someone else wrote, I feel like exploring.
Mhm.
I don't feel well at this moment.
Hmm. Thank you, Ron. And I know others will keep coming through. The purpose that I use, the goal of this slide and the activity is to showcase that a bunch of people who are bright and capable of empathic or cognitive empathy are able to look at the same image and still draw different inferences. And so while we all have the capacity for cognitive empathy, it's not a perfect science. And a lot of it has to do with how we feel. So some people might say, oh, what's going on over there? Because they're a curious person by nature, or I'm hungry. What are they eating? Maybe because lunchtime is coming up and you're feeling hungry. So cognitive empathy is a really important trait that we can develop with practice, but it's not a perfect science. All right. We're born with the capacity to empathize straight out of the womb. In fact, the 3-month mark is when emotional contagion kicks in. I noticed it with my own daughter. We were on a path. My daughter was 3 months old. She was in a stroller in a good mood. And we crossed paths with a mom and another baby in a stroller who was having a meltdown. And just as we passed each other, my daughter burst spontaneously into tears when she realized that this child was also crying. And I was actually quite excited as an empathy researcher to see it happen. But that's called emotional contagion. But it turns out we can become more empathic throughout our life cycle, all the way till our last few years of life, by practicing empathy. So how does that work? Well, just like you go to the gym and you do bicep curls and your bicep kind of builds up, turns out our brains work similarly. So this is the metaphor I use. So in Montreal, this is 1 week ago. I'm joking, but almost. Imagine a big football field of freshly fallen snow, excuse me, and you're a kid that has to cross this football field to get to the other side for school in the morning. So if you're the first child that has to cross the field, you have the heavy work of crossing that field, right? Taking the steps across the snow. But if you're the next typical kid and kid that follows and next kid that follows, you'll eventually follow in the footprints until a well-worn path is created. Well, that's how our neural connections are formed as well. When we're born, we have very few neural connections. And then in the 0 to 3 years, that first 3 years of life, all of the neural connections get formed because that's the largest amount of time where we've seen, heard, experienced things, thought things. And the more often we have a repeated thought or experience, the thicker our synaptic connections become. So a child that's born into a family where there's lots of love and tenderness and compassion is going to have a different set of neural connections, than would a child that's born into a family where there's lots of stress or strife or arguing or worse. And I used to think, oh my goodness, that poor child that's born into a circumstance that's not of their control. Not only are they going to have that sort of hardship as a child and as a baby, but they're going to grow to have different neural connections than from a better experience. And then I learned about neuroplasticity, which is the capacity for us to prune away old synaptic connections that don't serve us and replace them with newer ones by thinking more empathic thoughts and behaving in more empathic ways. We can change our neural connections. And I find a lot of power in that. And that's around the time that I was learning this, that I had the experience in the FedEx store. So if you hadn't asked the question, I would have told the story right here. It turns out that our brains also love the experience of empathy. These are the pleasure and reward centers of our brain that light up when we're eating a delicious piece of chocolate cake or when we're high on psychedelics. It turns out that when we're feeling empathy and feeling emotional connection to someone, the same pleasure and reward centers light up in our brain, which is really cool. Turns out that we also have a lot of physiological benefits when we're feeling emotionally connected to someone. Turns out that, not only does our breathing stabilize, and so we do a lot less shallow breathing, but a lot more deep breathing, which changes our parasympathetic nerve system, but also all the stress hormones like cortisol diminish. And those stress hormones are connected to a whole host of physical ailments, inflammation, which are connected to chronic diseases. Turns out that when we're in an empathic embrace, like I would have been in that experience with that customer care agent, what would be flooding my bloodstream and my body are serotonin, oxytocin, and the feel-good hormones that actually give us a sense of belonging and a sense of communion with others that keep our immune system functioning well. So it's really good for us to empathize, except when we reach empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue. So when we are constantly taking care of others and we don't recharge our batteries, we reach a wall. And what's happened over the last couple of years across the globe, no one's been untouched, is that we have achieved a collective sense of empathy fatigue. And what has happened in the workplace? Well, we've seen a lot of additional stress, incredibly high rates of burnout, and a sense of collective trauma. And this really matters to the workplace. So one of the impacts has been the Great Resignation, where people who have sort of felt this communal stress, anxiety, constant change, wondering about life, asking the existential questions about what am I doing with my time and my talent and my energy. We've seen the giant resignation or the Great Resignation. But we're also seeing a rise in what's known as presenteeism and quiet quitting. So people who are physically at work, but they're elsewhere in their heads. So they're not being as productive, or they're choosing, if they're not in an empathic organization, they're like, you know what? I'm only going to work to the T what's on my job description. And then I'm going to reclaim my life. I'm going to reclaim my weekends and my evenings. And so it matters for empathic workplaces because you want to have engaged employees. There's also the issue of psychological safety. not only is it very expensive to have toxic workplaces due to mental health issues and conflict resolution, but people no longer want to work in places where they feel shame. In the workplace, they want to feel authentic. They want to feel like they matter to the workplace, and that they come in to their workplace as human beings and people first before employees with a job to do. And I'm going to let you take in, I hear somebody's, if everybody could mute, because I hear a little echo. I'm going to let you take in some of these stats. This is coming out of Business Solver's recent Empathy in the Workplace study that, there's half of people say they've experienced a mental health problem this year in 2020, the research from 2022. And mental health is really important, but they don't feel their employers care about it. Less empathy. They feel like their workplace is not as empathic as it once was. They feel less motivated as a result. They can't talk about their mental health. And a very kind of, you can see the exclamation mark. People are willing to leave their workplaces because they think they can find a more empathic workplace, and they would work harder, longer hours, even if it meant less pay. So these are important to keep in mind. Of course, the drive.
Anita,
Yes?
sorry, are those US stats or Canadian stats or global?
They're global, 3,000 employees and CEOs and HR leaders from around the world. It's based in the UK, this survey, and I'm more than happy to share the link in the chat when I get to the end of the presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Equity, diversity, and inclusion, if we think the drive for it is now clear, and the business case has been made for it as well. But if you think about the underpinning of EDI, and lately I've heard EDI-B for belonging, is all underpinned by empathy, the idea of celebrating difference and rewarding, having a place where we reward authenticity and people feeling included. It requires empathy as a baseline. We're seeing also massive changes in how Gen Z sees the world and the values that they're bringing into the workplace, whether it's gender diversity or gender fluidity, whether it's sustainability and the idea of circular economy. They come with a host of new ways of working, including collaboration, and they believe that empathy is important and their mental health is important in their workplace. And this is causing quite a lot of conflict across different generations. So again, empathy for the different generations' values is key. There's a lot to say about new technology and what it means to actually, can robots develop empathy? There's already a lot of testing happening in call centers where AI chatbots are actually able to down-regulate people on the calls so that there's less sort of tension on phone calls. What does that mean for humanity? The conversation around, can robots actually empathize is really starting to take shape. And then I'll end with sort of these are the meta changes that are happening and impacting the workplace. It turns out that empathy actually drives KPIs, whether it's employee engagement or attracting new talent. It has a lot to do with social capital in the workplace, where if you feel empathy in the workplace with your colleagues, that changes how communication flows. There's less conflict. There's more innovation because people trust each other. You can take more risks because you trust each other. So there's a host of research showing that it matters to the bottom line. So if we care about this in the workplace, how can we become more empathic leaders? I would like to share a little anecdote. I'm sure everyone can relate to this sort of image of a conflict on the home front, right? And what happens if we're having a discussion or a conversation with someone and we're emotionally charged? I guess I could ask the question, are you listening to understand or are you listening to respond? Well, of course, we're listening to respond, and that's the way our brains are designed. When we feel emotionally triggered in any way, we are locked in a desire to prove how we are right or to defend our position, and we're not listening to understand. So empathy actually is very important when you are trying to resolve a conflict. Now, I'm going to share a little anecdote in the workplace and a 6-step process to actually engage your natural capacity to empathize in a stressful situation. So I want you to imagine you are a leader and you're at your desk, you check your email, and you've got an email that says one of your projects with a client has gone sideways, and now you're going to have to spend the weekend at work sort of problem solving. And you had great weekend plans and they've been kiboshed, and you're really frustrated about this. And you're stressed out. And at the exact moment that you're sort of reacting to this email, there's a knock on your door and your star employee comes in and says, "Excuse me, do you have a minute to talk?" And so you say, "Yeah, of course, come have a seat." So you're stressed out yourself. And now you have to sort of, be responsive to, let's say, an example might be, I need to take a week off because my mom is being put into an elder care home with the onset of dementia. So our brains actually cannot be in a state of empathy and a state of anxiety or stress simultaneously. We can oscillate between the two, but we can't be in both simultaneously. So you're stressed about your own circumstances, and now you need to be available in an empathic way for your employee. So here's the process that I'd like to share. The first step is to gain self-awareness that you are stressed out. I think that we do a great job in our culture of listening to our intelligence, and we listen to our thoughts. Oh, sorry, I hear that somebody is unmuted. If we can all mute, there we go. So when our bodies are telling us something, we don't always pay attention. So for example, you might feel sort of irritation in your belly, or you might feel like rushed and shallow breathing, or you might feel your cheekbones flushed. All of those are signs, or maybe you're thirsty all of a sudden. All those are bodily signs that you're stressed. So we need to gain self-awareness as a first step in order to move through the rest of the stages. The second one is to gain a little bit of self-regulation. So now you know that you want to be less stressed. You want to access empathy. So how can we move quickly from a stress state into an empathic state? Through some self-regulation. And the simplest, fastest, surefire way to do that is through some deep breathing. So the 5-5-5 is a really great exercise where you breathe in for a count of 5, you hold for a count of 5, and then you breathe out for a count of 5. And that can be, nobody needs to notice that you're doing that, but it's just going to help your body down-regulate from its stress into a different headspace. Then you can do the important task of what I call bridge crossing, where you make the decision cognitively to get out of your own headspace and to cross the bridge and enter someone else's where they're at, in order to, for the fourth step, perspective take. So this is where we actually trigger our cognitive empathy, or what I call our purposeful empathy. So we're holding the space for someone to share what's going on in their lives, holding the space with curiosity and empathy. And what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? Well, for starters, it often means being silent. We are usually prone to problem solve or to share an experience of our own that relates to what they're going through. And silence is delicious to people who are sharing something emotionally laden. And sometimes silence, even though it could be uncomfortable for a nanosecond or two, actually allows somebody to say something even more deep than they would have if you were quick to speak. So remember that silence is golden. And the other thing that I would offer that I think is really valuable is that we're very poor listeners. We're often, and our brains are like that, right? When somebody shares something with us, we think our brains try to match how that connects with, things that we already believe, or it reminds us of something that happened. And so when you're present for someone else and you're holding space for someone else, one of the best hacks that I can offer is to just repeat back 2 or 3 words that you just heard from the person. And that sometimes feels mechanical or robotic, but to the person who's speaking, especially sharing something that's important, hearing a few words that were just uttered is like a balm. So get into the practice of just repeating back 2 or 3 words that you just heard. and see how it opens up space for more empathy to emerge. The next step is the empathic action. So in the workplace context, this person's just asked for 5 days off. You've just heard about their mom going into a home. And is that really the time to whip out the calendar and sort of problem solve and redelegate work so the project moves forward? Maybe not the ideal time. So the empathic action there is to actually thank the person for sharing what was difficult to share, and invite them to do something that would be self-care. Invite them to go for a walk or to get a glass of water, and let them come back to you and say, let's figure out how we can redelegate the work, but let's not do that now. Come back and let's talk about it later this afternoon or tomorrow when you're ready. And that empathic action in this context matters so much and will feel again like such a gift to the person that they will come back further engaged. And then the last step, which is what leaders often ignore, forget about, bypass, is self-empathy. And we go straight back to task without actually addressing how that experience might have actually triggered something in us emotionally. Or we have to go back to thinking about that stressful email where now our weekend has been stolen. So it's really, really, really important to actually have practices for self-empathy so that we can continue to be empathic leaders. So if we're feeling stressed out, here are some ways in which we can practice some self-empathy. So the first is what's known in Japan as shirin-yuku. It's called forest bathing. The idea of spending time in nature is becoming increasingly studied, and the research is clear that being in nature actually really helps us recharge our batteries. There's healing properties to nature. Another practice, and I might ask us to do this because it's been a while since we've done some audience engagement, is that I will invite everyone to take a moment. Well, first of all, let's take a moment just to sort of see how your body is feeling, how you're feeling, sort of like, do you have a headache? Are you tired? Is your neck all crinkled? How are you feeling? Just take a moment to sort of just take a gauge on how we're feeling. And then I might, instead of using the chat box, I might invite like 10 of us to share something we're grateful for. So you can unmute. Maybe what you could do is put in the chat box, I'm ready to do this. And that way.
Actually, just raise your hand.
Oh, raise your hand. Okay, beautiful. Raise your hand. So raise your hand. We're going to hear something you're grateful for.
Who would like to share what they're grateful for? Just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Well, I'll start, Anita.
Okay.
I'm grateful for this session and for being your friend.
I see Andrea.
Yes.
Hi, I'm grateful for my family.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Who else? I can call on Andre. Oh, Warren. Okay. Hello, Warren. Warren, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, I'm grateful for the patience of good friends.
Oh, I love that. Who else would like to share? Shall I call on Hafsa or Maria? Oh, Maria.
Hello, I just wanted to share that I'm grateful that I'm able to have education and be part of this session today.
Beautiful. Hafsa.
Yeah, I'm grateful to have a great family, a great sister, and a nice environment around me.
Oh, I love that. Okay, well, thank you. If anybody feels like sharing what they're grateful for, please use the chat box. Now, if we had done this in a room, what we would have done is I invited you all to take sort of like a pulse on how your body is feeling. And I would have asked sort of to sense the energy in the room. If I take 10 or 12 answers in a row, we would have actually felt collectively the energy of the space shift. And we would have actually felt our parasympathetic nerve system kicking in where we would be naturally smiling. There's something known as Schadenfreude, where we take pleasure in someone else's misfortune. But the flip side is also available to us as well, which is that we take sympathetic joy, we take pleasure in other people's joy. And gratitude, when we listen to other people share what they're grateful for, actually takes us out of a headspace of stress or anxiety. And I call it the superhighway to access empathy. So thank you all for sharing. I am going to move my slide along. Another example of how we can practice empathy, and even when we're feeling stressed out, is to do something known as metta meditation. Metta is the Sanskrit word for loving kindness. And I'm often asked, well, what does loving kindness mean? And what it means to me is just being like thinking kind thoughts about other people, sending them goodwill and peace of mind. So when I send loving kindness to people, I often think, if you're in a rush, I hope you get all the green lights, or I hope you get the parking spot that you want. So a 4-step process in practicing metta meditation, which you can do in the shower, which you can do when you're driving, or as a daily ritual, is to think about people you love. So you take a deep breath and you think about people you love and you send them loving kindness. And you do that for about a minute. And then the second step is another deep breath and send loving kindness to people you like. So people that you work with, maybe some friends from high school that you haven't seen in a while, maybe some of your friendly neighbors, and you send them loving kindness. The third step, another deep breath, you send loving kindness to people you don't know, people you'll never meet, people that are complete strangers. So that could be the farmer who has a wheat farm, and that wheat showed up in the toast that you ate for breakfast. You'll never meet that farmer, but you send him or her loving kindness. And then the final step, which is actually harder to do, is you send loving kindness to people who have disappointed you, or people who really see the world differently than you, either politically or ideologically. And you send them loving kindness too. This is the hard part, because it's really requiring a flexing of empathy muscles. And you're sending them loving kindness, even if they hurt your feelings or disappointed you, because you're accepting the fact that they are working from the level of consciousness that they are at. So the woman who at FedEx, if I hadn't asked her, how are you? And I just sort of saw her as this mean, grumpy, rude person, maybe she deserved loving kindness as well. So this is the practice that could actually flex your empathy muscles. Another great exercise, which is tough to do because it requires a degree of vulnerability and courage, but I do it with all the workshops that I run and with all my students at McGill, is a simple act of eye gazing. And I do it within the finance, I do it with people in law, I do it people who work in the defense industry, and it only takes 2 minutes of your life. I really recommend that you do it. You set up a timer for 30 seconds to eye gaze, and it's not a staring competition. And the only rule is no talking. And those 30 seconds are very, very awkward and weird. And then once the 30 seconds are done, there's a little bit of chit chat with you and your partner to sort of kind of shake off the nerves. And then you do another 90 seconds of eye gazing. And there the goal is to really pay attention to your breathing and to soften into a loving kindness metta stance. Your body's open, you don't cross your legs, you don't cross your hands, and you see the person that you're partnering with, and you allow yourself to be seen. And inevitably what happens in a lot of these spaces is that people sometimes are moved to tears. And often what I hear in my classroom with my undergrads, which is getting increasingly concerning to me, is I don't remember the last time I looked into someone else's eyes. But this eye gazing exercise is powerful to humanize the person with whom you're doing the exercise. The last exercise.
Anita, I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
What about looking at yourself in the mirror, like looking at your own eyes in the mirror? Is that something that is helpful?
I wonder. I suppose it would be. I've never done it. I used to have a practice of winking at myself to wish myself good luck for the day, but I've never done eye gazing. I've actually tried it on Zoom a couple of times, and it's not quite the same because we're looking elsewhere than the little green dot. But But that's a really interesting question. So thank you for that. I imagine that it's quite helpful, especially if you're sort of trying to forgive yourself for something. We're really always constantly berating ourselves and upbraiding ourselves for not being good enough or making mistakes. So I think that that's probably a good practice. Thank you for that question. The other practice that I would recommend is active listening. So I'm certified in what's known as empathy circling, and if anybody's interested, I can post a link as well. Where the idea is that you learn the practice of listening to others without judgment, bias, or interference. Again, I mentioned earlier that when we listen, we're often listening with the intention to respond. And our brains are always looking for content that matters to us, making information salient. But listening to understand is a practice. And so what's involved in the empathy circling is that, let's say you're 5 people, and let's say you do this for half an hour. There's a first pair that speaks and reflects back what they hear. And there's 4 minutes per pair, and then it moves around the entire circle. So everybody has a chance to do it once or twice. And you don't speak for a monologue of 4 minutes. You speak for a couple of sentences, and then the person who's listening reflects back what they hear. And it goes back and forward for those 4 minutes, and then it switches to another pair and another pair. And in the act of responding and reflecting back what you're hearing, you realize how poor a listener we all are and how much cognitive power is involved in actually properly listening to understand. Because often when you reflect back, the person who's spoken says, actually, no, what I meant was, and then you reflect back until you get it right. This is a very, very, very powerful tool to realize that when you're trying to sit with someone and understand what they're sharing with you, what kind of cognition and purposeful empathy is needed. So that's another action. So on to how we can create more empathic cultures. I'm going to go quickly through this so we have time for questions. I'll share just a quick story about how powerful empathy by design is. This is a mammogram, and General Electric, big multinational, sells these mammogram machines and hired a design company to increase their market share. And they said, you have 4 months to come back with some strategy recommendations, but the only thing you can't do is change the specs of the machine. So in the first step of a design process is empathizing with the end user. So they could have spoken to the technicians, they could have spoken to the doctors or nurses who use the machines, but instead they said they were going to get more insight by speaking to the patients, generally speaking, women who get mammograms. So the first thing that women shared about mammograms is that they're painful, but they knew they couldn't address that issue without changing the machine specs. The second thing that they heard from women is that we all hate the waiting rooms. The waiting rooms are sterile, their temperature's cold, they're anxiety producing. So the design company said, that's a very interesting insight. Now, who can we speak to that sells products or services to women who are stressed out using the product or service? So they turned to none other than Victoria's Secret, and discovered that the lingerie company knows that women are stressed shopping for their product. And so they create environments that are meant to reduce anxiety. So the music choice, the upholstery, the lighting, the scent of the candles, all of it is meant to help women feel more comfortable. So they took that as their major insight and shared with the board of directors of GE that they should sell not only the machines, but the waiting room as a 2-for-1. And the board thought that was a crazy idea, but they made their case and they said, just try it with 2 test sites. So in fact, they tried it in a suburban and an urban site. Not only did the women who got the mammograms enjoy the experience better thanks to this waiting room, but because women were less stressed going into their mammograms, their breast tissue was less dense, and they found early markers of cancer sooner, so it actually had an impact on the outcome of their lives. So that's the power of empathy in design. And we can design for empathic cultures in the workplace. I had the experience of being invited to work with a med school. And they wanted me to sort of increase the empathy in the curriculum so that they could graduate more empathic physicians. And I was like, all for that, wanted to take the mandate, but I asked, why are you starting so far downstream? Why not actually create an entire empathic organization? And we talked about this and they bought into it. And so I ended up doing a design session with the 25 senior managers of this med school. And I asked 3 questions. I asked, what would it look like if we practiced more self-empathy in the workplace? So what would the practices look like? What would the policies look like? Second question is, how would it look to have more empathy for others in the workplace, right, across the relationship domain? And the third was, how could your organization demonstrate more empathy to you? 3 out of the 5 groups or breakout groups that answered this question had the same answer to that question, which is, we would like a staff lounge. We don't have a staff lounge. We meet in workplaces, and we also have lunch in these meeting rooms. Why can't we have a staff lounge? The leadership team really heard this, and within a weekend, changed a storage room that had the photocopying machine and a bunch of other supplies and turned it into a staff lounge. And I was with them when they did the big reveal. And I watched 25 full-blown adults react as though it was like a birthday to this space that was now theirs. And the reason I share this story is that we think that there has to be this massive plan, this big strat plan on how to create a more empathic organization, when it can be as simple as asking people, how can we make this place more empathic for you? So the last bonus question I have is, can we leverage purposeful empathy to change our lives? It turns out that 40,000 years ago, human beings were not the only large brain species on the planet. There were 4 or 5 other large brain species with us. But humans, Homo sapiens, are the ones that survived. Why? People who study our evolutionary, our evolution say the whites of our eyes grew very big. We lost most of our facial hair. Our testosterone dropped. A whole host of physiological changes happened so that we could read each other's facial expressions, read each other without using language, so that we could collaborate against the elements and come together. So empathy, that idea of being able to read each other without speaking, has been part of our successful evolution as a species. And we need to reclaim that, in my mind. Now, if we travel 6 or 8 or 10 million years ago, depending on which scientist you speak to, we also have common ancestry with chimpanzee on the left and the bonobo on the right. In our culture, we believe we're very chimp-like, right? Because they're competitive by nature, hierarchical by nature, prone to open warfare, just like us. Littered through our history is the chimpanzee story. But there's Frans de Waal, who is a primatologist from the Netherlands, who studies bonobo culture and says, hey, they're loving by nature, they are nurturing by nature, they are kind and compassionate by nature, just like us. And in fact, humans share more DNA in common with chimps and more DNA in common with bonobos than they share with each other. And the story in our culture is that we are chimp-like, when I believe we all know from lived experience that we are also bonobo-like. Why shouldn't we turn up the volume of empathy in our lives? The last thing I'll leave you with is that the idea of becoming our full expression, our full potential, was sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that once our baseline needs are met, to achieve all that we can be as humans is to self-actualize, right? But he said just before he died that, in fact, humans really benefit from self-transcendence, this idea of being of purpose to something larger than ourselves, having impact, which I think is what this series and what the program is all about. And all the luminaries that have walked the earth and all of the great traditions of religion or spirituality have all come to the same conclusion. And I think that purposeful empathy, sustained purposeful empathy, is really about self-transcendence, being of service to others or something greater than ourselves. So here's where I'll just say thank you, and I'm totally open to answering questions. If you want, you can ask me questions via LinkedIn. And of course, I have a weekly podcast that you can follow where I speak to other people who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So thank you. Oh, I don't hear you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Anita. At this point, if you would like to turn on your cameras, please do so if you feel comfortable. And please raise your hand if you have a question. We'll stay on for, Anita, are you okay to stay on for another 10 minutes for
Absolutely.
questions?
Absolutely.
So if you have questions, just raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask your question live to Anita. I have a question for you, Anita. So out of the organizations, you worked with many organizations. What are, and you gave some examples as well. Um, have you ever had some surprising or been exposed to companies that really lack empathy and what the effect that has had on the company itself or on the company culture, or a company culture that you see as less empathetic and you think, oh, these guys could learn a lot more about this?
Yeah, what's
And maybe
interesting,
you don't have to name the company if you don't want to, but
I won't name the company. I often get asked the question, oh, it sounds really nice what you're saying. Like in a perfect world, we'd all be more empathic, but we're a high performance culture and we have deliverables and we have sales targets and we are under pressure and supply chain issues during COVID and inflation and all these sort of like business, barriers to empathy. And my pushback is that they've got it wrong, because being a high performance culture requires a degree of nimble. It actually requires being able to think quick on your feet, being innovative and be problem solving and collaborative. Those are the characteristics of a high performance culture. And as I said earlier, what enables relationships to thrive where you don't second guess somebody? You get an email. You know how many people have received an email and you didn't like the tone because you assume the worst of that person because you had this like bad experience? There's fraught with all of these question marks about other people's dubious politics and maneuvers. In fact, when you have an empathic organization where you like the people you work with and you trust each other, all of that improves. The communication improves, the trust level improves, the sense of belonging improves, the innovation and the performance improves. So when you have hostile work environments, people are afraid to speak up. You get groupthink. There's a lot more risk for mental health and burnout, which of course costs the bottom line, and all the conflict resolution issues sort of go up as well. Great question. I see Warren and Dante and Sylvie. Awesome.
we'll start with Dante from Sao Paulo. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi guys. Hi. Thank you, Anita,
Hi.
for the speech and everything. So my question is, according to your view, what's basically the difference between empathy and compassion?
Obrigada. The way I see compassion is it's the part of empathy where we feel what someone else is feeling. And the empathy, the difference is that it's made up of two ways of expressing connection with someone. First is the affective empathy, which is the compassion piece. And the second piece is the cognitive empathy, the capacity to perspective take, which is a choice. And we can become better empathizers with time by practicing empathy. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Warren.
Hi, Anita. Thank you very much. Really enlightening direction. And my question is, how does one maintain empathy in an organization or a place that they feel like they're swimming upstream every day against the tide?
It's a tough one. That's a really tough one. Well, so guided by your values, you'll either be someone who's a social intrapreneur by still showing up as an empathic leader compassionately, trying to change the organizational culture by osmosis, or you'll realize that you're in a situation where there's incompatibility, which is why we're seeing a lot of people leave places that they don't think are empathic enough. I think what's really important is if you're in a leadership role and you're feeling that you're swimming uphill or upstream, is to actually make the business case for more empathy with the most senior leadership to get them on board. And to actually not treat, I'll share a little anecdote, and I won't share what the company is, but I was delighted, not even maybe 2 months ago, to see that a firm that's in the headhunting business put out a white paper on leadership and the kind of leaders that are needed for today and tomorrow. And one of the 5 characteristics that they had in the white paper was empathy. You need more empathy in leadership. So I was very excited to meet that individual who's running the organization and to ask about how this research came to be, only to discover that it had been outsourced to a consultant. And I thought, oh, that's why EDI is also a competency, like they're turning into the flavor of the month. And I don't want to see empathy washing. It's not meant to be a tick box where it's like on your corporate values or your organizational values or what you say to your external stakeholders. Empathy as a value means that we care about each other, because humanity, like one of the flaws that we have as humans is that we tend to empathize with people who are like us, and we tend to empathize less with people who are others. And in a workplace, you've got leadership and employees. There tends to be this othering of each other, right? Where there's a lot of conflict, especially if there's like unionized spaces. And we want to actually get to a place where we can transcend those differences. So empathy embedded as a cultural value actually really serves organizations on so many ways. So either you are a social entrepreneur and you speak to that leadership opportunity, or it might make sense to leave. Great question.
Sylvie,
Thank you.
go ahead, Sylvie.
Salut, Sylvie.
Hi. Bonjour, comment tu vas?
Ça va bien.
Good. I'll revert back in English. And my question, because I'm following you on your book tour and I'm halfway through your book, also because I'm reading Henry's books and I got too many going. But having said this, from the book tour right now, what have you learned on empathy that was new?
Oh, that's such a great question, Sylvie, because I was leaving on my book tour, flying from Trudeau Airport in Montreal to Boston, and my flight got canceled, not delayed, canceled. And so I found myself in a lineup at the Air Canada counter. I had to take another flight 6 hours later, rerouted via Newark. It was not fun, but I was next to a woman and we were both at the counter at the same time. And I was sort of feeling good in my heart because I was excited about this embarking on the book tour. And in my mind, I was reframing the cancellation of my flight as, okay, well, something had to go wrong. Let's get it out of the gates quick and let's have a smooth riding from here. So I remember having a conversation with the customer care service agent and reading his name on his label, which is a very important empathic act that we can all pick up as a small little hack. And I had a really lovely chat with him. I knew he was doing his best to problem solve. And I witnessed the woman next to me just not having it. And I just witnessed, and I've been her. I'm not a perfect empathizer all the time. I've had things go wrong where I've been miserable. And I just witnessed how tough it was for the person who was like managing her. And I just realized, oh, empathy is always available to us if we have the capacity for empathy, right? So we can't be stressed and empathetic at the same time. I witnessed that moment. I had the capacity to be empathic with the guy who was managing my rerouting, but she didn't. That happened, and I saw it in real time. And another story I'll share on the book tour is I have a memory of getting in an Uber and asking the driver if I could sit in the front. And this was in Manhattan, and we drove for almost an hour together, and we talked about all sorts of wonderful things. And at the end of the ride, I got out, I thanked him, and it was just a lovely conversation. And he held my wrist And he said, in the 20 years I've been driving in New York, I've never had a passenger ask to sit in the front, and I want to thank you.
Wow.
And that will never leave me, that story. It still moves me to tears because it once again showcases how powerful it could be to be kind. And so, Sylvie, thanks for asking that question, because I think we all deserve to live lives where more of our humanity is present. We're in a society, things are moving fast. We're managing the stresses of work and life and home. And I think if we all dial up the volume of empathy in our lives, we'd all be better off for it.
Bravo.
On that positive note, thank you so much, Anita. I think we'll end the session officially here, but I'm sure you don't mind if people connect to you on LinkedIn. I just want to thank Anita, you especially, obviously, for being here today and sharing your insights with us. And I want to thank all of you for joining us from all over the world, wherever you are. Please join us on June 28th when we have our next Impact series, which will be with brand strategist and world-renowned author Larry Ackerman. And Larry's going to be talking about how to define your own personal identity. He has helped companies and individuals find their true purpose and place in the world. And so it'll be an interesting topic. Anita, thank you again so much, and we wish you so well on the rest of your book tour. And we look forward to hearing more about your adventures in the coming weeks. So thank you so much.
Namaste. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.